Well, what's up, ladies and gentlemen, wherever you might be around the world. Of course, I am Jay Campbell, and I'm joined by my trusty sidekick, Hunter Williams. And we are very blessed, humbled, and honored today to be joined in our StreamYard virtual studio with the one and only Laura Knight-Jadczyk, which I can actually pronounce her name professionally now, and Harrison. Hopefully, I don't butcher his last name. Is it Cooley or Koehli?
Well, the first was the accurate original pronunciation, but my family goes by Koehli.
Koehli. Okay, awesome. Well, it's very nice to have you on the show today. You are a very, very astute historian, and we are grateful to have you. I'm going to switch it over to Hunter real quick so I can go live on Instagram. But thank you to everyone who's watching us from around the world.
Yeah, well, thank you guys for being here. I'm like a kid before Christmas whenever we had to talk to Laura, and then with Harrison too. I do want to plug Harrison's newsletter is, correct me if I'm wrong, Harrison, it's just the Cassiopaea newsletter on Substack. Is that the title of it? Or where would people go to find it?
Yeah, I think it's, well, the easiest way to find it is just Cassiopaea.substack.com.
Okay.
P-A-E-A.
Gotcha. Yeah, everyone should check that out. Jay and I, we use a lot of email stuff and our businesses, and there's like a handful of emails that I like look forward and I'm giddy when I get them. And that is probably in the top 3. So definitely go check that out. Harrison is a genius, and I would say savant when it comes to like understanding a lot of history stuff, but then also too of taking Laura's work with the C's and kind of like bringing it like to the forefront and connecting it to current events, which is something that is so cool to me. And, like I love listening to. So thank you guys for being here. I know today we're going to talk a lot about biblical history stuff. I know Laura, like back and forth over email, we've gone back on some of the stuff, I think, with Wesly, Huff, and Billy Carson that has kind of been brought to the forefront of a lot of mainstream stuff recently, which I think is cool just to have that dialogue and debate about some of these things, because a lot of those topics were suppressed for so long. So I think we're going to go deep on some biblical history stuff. So I'm really, really excited. So thank you guys for being here.
Hunter, can you check and see if it says we're live? I'm getting this Instagram issue again where it says it's live, but I can't find it.
Let me check. I'll check right now and just confirm through
If it's not, I'm just going to delete it and just start it again. Sorry about that, guys. Sometimes Instagram just doesn't let us go live. It says it's live, but it's not.
Yeah, I'm trying to pull it up.
It's probably not, but that's cool. We got there's plenty of people watching. Okay. So obviously Hunter set us up. It's great to have you, Harrison, here today, of course. And we did just do a show, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago, that was also really good and well received. There's so much stuff going on with you guys, with all of, for all of us in the world right now, with like the USAID or whatever, USAID as I like to call it, with everything that's being revealed and just how big of a debacle and a scam, the government has been just polluting and really looting the entire world, the American taxpayer especially. But obviously we want to talk about Bible history and where we're going with today. But I think it's all, from a hyperdimensional standpoint, I think it's all relative and it's all interrelated. But Laura, just you got a chance to listen to Billy Carson, who's a friend of mine, debate Wesly Huff, or talk to him about Wesly Huff. What was your original impressions of just their initial conversation?
Well, it was a conversation. It definitely wasn't a debate. I mean, generally when you have a debate, you have an agreed upon topic, and one side may argue one side of it and the other side will argue the other side of it, and at least they've got some things that are in common. They were just having 2 completely different conversations. I mean, it just I had a lot of sympathy for Billy Carson because he was just blindsided by this young hotshot preppy guy with his PhD studies going on in the background. And I'll say right up front here, I do not have a PhD. Okay. But I have been studying this topic for well over 35 years. And I have probably read every book on the subject. And when I'm reading books, I look to the footnotes and I pick up the references to the different academic papers, and I get and read those. And Harrison was in charge of organizing my library one day, and he can tell you what a mess I have. And you guys saw it too. You saw that
We've
huge
seen your library.
section on religion and history. So that was not a debate. It was like, apples and oranges, two ships just passing in the night, barely seeing each other because they weren't even talking about the same subjects.
Right.
So and I had a lot of, I went on further to watch the Joe Rogan interview with Huff. And I downloaded the transcripts of both, the Billy Carson and Huff discussion,
right,
and the Joe Rogan discussion. And I downloaded both of them and read through them to see what was really going on. Reading one of those transcripts, it's not easy, believe me. But, it was, Wesley Huff is just Bart Ehrman 2.0. In a sense, he's a Christian apologist, and that's mainly what he's doing. And he's not as smart as he thinks he is. Wesley, if you ever hear me say this, just understand that I mean that in a kind way, because you're young, and come on, I'm married to an academic and an educator for 30 years, and the one thing he complains about the most, or did before he was retired, was that the young hotshots come along and think they've invented the wheel. They don't read the papers. They don't know that other people have thought of things and said things and done things a long time ago that they know nothing about, and they get out there and they really make complete asses of themselves. So yeah, anyway, have some humility and maybe do a lot more research, because we're going to talk to you tonight about some of the research you could be doing, and it could be beneficial to humanity. So that's my comment on it. Maybe Harrison would like.
Harrison, I was just going to go to you. So what are your thoughts?
Well, I think I summarized my kind of overall bird's eye impression of it as, if I was just looking at it from an outsider's perspective, with I know I don't even know as much as Laura. I'm not a PhD either. I'm not an expert. I'm a biblical hobbyist. I mean, I've probably read more books than the average person, but by no means could be considered an expert. But from my perspective, looking in, I thought that even if they were talking at cross purposes, they both made good points, but they both missed a bigger point in my mind. So they are both operating in my mind on certain assumptions, certain shared assumptions, even if they disagree on the details. And that is, from Carson's perspective, he's looking at a lot of these ancient texts, ancient Near Eastern or biblical texts, or like post-biblical apocryphal texts, like the Gospel of Barnabas that came up. He's looking at those and he's reading them as stories, as if we can kind of take them at face value. So he looks at the Gospel of Barnabas and says, oh, it says Jesus wasn't crucified, so therefore historically maybe it's possible that Jesus wasn't crucified. But there's an assumption that that's actually even describing history in any sense. It isn't necessarily. And Huff, coming from a totally opposite position, a mainstream Christian position, is operating on a similar assumption about the biblical text. So he's an expert in texts, in script, in language, and in papyri and how things are written, and the way script changes over time, and dating texts and transcribing texts. But as he admits, in his interview with Rogan, he's a specialist, and there are others who specialize in other aspects and other fields, other subfields of biblical studies. And there's a lot of controversy in the first 100 years of Christianity. Like, this is what Laura's book From Paul to Mark is all about. There's a lot more controversy than the mainstream Christians will either admit or admit to themselves. And so I see their shared assumption is that Huff, I won't say Huff in specific, biblical scholars in general tend to assume or conclude based on how they read the evidence that the Gospels are describing historical events. All these things actually happened, and that the purpose of the books is just to write down what happened. And I think that that's a faulty assumption on both of their parts. And so if we go below the level of the debate or the conversation, I think that for me was what stood out about both of them, because you can see, just to wrap up, to go back to Carson, you can see in some of the sources he didn't necessarily mention, but that he kind of echoes, like Zechariah Sitchin. Like, that's Sitchin's problem too. He's reading a lot into an old text to try to discern these historical events and this mythology that's actually history. That's you're skipping a couple steps to get to that point, and I think that's the problem. That's a problem with both the mainstream and with the alternative history people, is that they're taking texts pretty much at face value, when I don't think that's the smart thing to do.
Yeah, and I'd like to say something at this point. A lot of people, mainly Christians, but other people as well, have the idea that when you get it deeply into biblical studies, that you are, anti-Bible or anti-Christian or anti-spiritual in some sense. And I'd like to just clear that up right now. I mean, anybody who's listened to anything I've talked about, knows that I am definitely not anti-spiritual, and I have a completely different view of reality than most people have, and that's actually what got me in trouble, because the Christians went after me because I'm pointing out that there are some issues with the Bible. But then the New Age people went after me because I was pointing out that there are problems with the New Age approach to this thing. For example, the belief in the Temple of Solomon, the kingdom of David and followed by the kingdom of Solomon. The Temple of Solomon is a centerpiece of many occult activities, ideas, rituals, and so on and so forth. I mean, Masons, for example.
Right.
So the existence of the Temple of Solomon is accepted by them as being a given. Archaeology says it isn't so. And, really good biblical research also says it isn't so. At the time that the Temple of Solomon's kingdom was supposed to exist, the city of Jerusalem was about 4 hectares and maybe 2,000 people max. So, there was no great kingdom of David and Solomon. There was a kingdom of Omri and Ahab in northern Palestine, but the Bible gives him short shrift because he wasn't a Yahwist. But one thing I will say also is that I spent a large part of my working life doing hypnotherapy. And I've gone inside people's heads and done, followed procedures for what they call past life regressions or spirit release therapy, that sort of thing. And, if there is anything to past lives, reincarnation, and I am convinced there is, because I've had some profound personal experiences in that respect. People come and go into different incarnations and different religions, different skin colors, different ethnicities. They run the gamut. And so for somebody to come and say, this is the way it is, and the only way it is, and you only get one life, and you're either saved or you're damned or whatever, it's just, to me, it's a complete absurdity. And even as far as Christianity goes, from what I see, they really got Paul's message wrong. They don't really understand what Paul was all about. And Paul was the bringer of Christianity, not a Jesus of Nazareth. So, and we'll get into that in just a little bit, but I just want people to know that I am perfectly aware that there is a divine cosmic mind. I am an adherent of the ideas of intelligent design. I don't think that if you think intelligent design is the way to go, that you need necessarily to run back to the old time religion. I think we need to look at these things, more or less scientifically. And that's what I've been doing for the past 35 years, is looking at our reality more or less scientifically. My studies have included, years and years of looking at strange anomalies, the paranormal. Stuff happens all over this planet. If you haven't read the books of Charles Fort or John Keel, or throw me some other books, Harrison, because there are so many that yeah,
Oh,
I mean,
man.
yeah.
Well,
There's
I
too
go by
many to
fields.
name.
I mean, there's like there are great people in all kinds of fields of the paranormal. So you've got, of course, your people focusing on UFOs, and then the philosophy of parapsychology, and then parapsychology. So there's dozens of good ones. But yeah,
And
so Fort and Keel are kind of the two giants that you mentioned. I don't think there's any real there's no one really that comes close to those two, but there's some that kind of
Morris Jessup wrote an excellent book on UFOs and made some excellent points. And there are stories and studies, firsthand witness accounts of poltergeist phenomena, of or demonic possession phenomena, of in my own house we have experienced very strange things. So I know that there is a spiritual reality. I'm not a materialist, but you see, I really want to know what is the bottom line of all of this, because Christianity has only been something that's been going on for the past 2,000 years, according to the standard timeline. And before that, all of these other things existed and continue to exist, and they exist outside of the parameters of Christianity, and miracles and different kinds of things can occur outside of the parameters of Christianity. And you've got what you've got with the Bible is you've got a God that comes along and says, "I am the only God," and every other God, of course, in the beginning, that acknowledges that there are other gods, but then later on, it doesn't even acknowledge that they exist. I mean, that by the time you get to Isaiah. And he underwrites this, by saying, because I said so. And and of course, you shall never, you shall not suffer a witch to live, or you can't, I mean, look at what happened to Saul when he called up the witch of Endor. He lost his kingdom, which means basically that David usurped a kingdom that didn't belong to him, but nobody wants to talk about that. So, I understand where Billy Carson is coming from. He's interested in all these phenomena, but like Harrison said, he and so many others assume that the text that they're working off of, is history, that it's historical fact, and it was believed to be such for hundreds of years. So, and so many occultists, their operations in some cases are based upon the reversal of Christianity or Christian ideas. And that means that they're reversing something that they believe exists. And they believe that their reversal of this gives them some kind of efficacy in their negative take on the whole thing. And if it's all, just a snow job or a fraud, they're all messed up. And that's why they went after me. I mean, the Christians went after me, and then the New Age types, the occultists went after me big time. Oh, big time. And then, of course, the materialists, the scientific types, because how dare you, bring up any kind of spiritual reality or suggest that Darwinian evolution, even at the, the ultimate level of the Darwinian evolution of the cosmos, isn't true. So, that's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying that there is something really strange about our world. We live in a really strange reality. There are levels of reality above us that are occupied by beings of either paraphysical or semi-physical natures, some purely spiritual, consciousness natures, and there is a lot of strange stuff going on, and we really need to figure out what this show is all about before it's over.
Well, so like let me just interject that, and Hunter, you can follow up. Is that we started following your work, meaning Hunter and I, now about 1.5 years ago, and obviously we read The Wave, we read Secret History, we've read pretty much all of your books. And I think for anyone who's watching this show, or anyone who will be watching, because there's a lot of people watching live right now, but those who, the great majority will watch the recording, because it will be all these places like YouTube and obviously Instagram and X. And X keeps their videos now and their algorithm actually better than I think YouTube does. It's a whole game that they're playing. But I think we have to have awareness, or the people to understand what we're talking about at the level that we're talking about it at. They have to have a hyperdimensional understanding of reality, which you just said. And unfortunately, a lot of people on this planet at this level in time still don't, which is mind-blowing to me. That they are, like you said, materialists or atomists or whatever you want to call it. And, all they can measure is what they can observe with their own 2 eyes. They don't believe in the unseen. They don't believe in the etheric. They don't believe in higher dimensional, aspects of reality or awareness. And so they're like not on a level playing field. And that's, I think, the greatest, dichotomy as we have these conversations, that, some people just cannot, if they can't observe it, it doesn't exist. And so they're not going to really go out to where we're talking about. But obviously, again, in your works, and obviously you borrowed from many, many great philosophers and authors and historians and researchers, it's pretty much provable, at least in my opinion, in my view, and I know all of you guys share it with me, that the unseen does exist. You want to follow up, Hunter, real quick?
Well, yeah, I actually had a question for Laura. First, I'll say, just from my personal experience, Laura, found Secret History. It's probably been like 3.5 years ago now. And I read it, or read a majority of it.
Yeah.
And I didn't understand it because I didn't have the context for understanding hyperdimensionality. And so I was reading it with my lens of like growing up as an evangelical church Christian, and then moving through a period of like where I thought I was an atheist, and then moving to like back towards like having like a spiritual center. But I still didn't understand the context of like hyperdimensionality, of what that meant from a construct of like how the world exists. But to go back, so I think like Jay was saying, like it would be kind of like 1,000 years from now if you found a geometry book and you said that that was the basis for reality. It's not necessarily wrong, but it's also one little section of like everything else there is out there. There's English, there's all these different things out there in the reality that can inform your understanding of knowledge and wisdom and consciousness. But to go back to the text, I've listened to some of the Wes Huff stuff, and not specifically just about him, but I think a lot of people make this mistake, is they go say, okay, there's this text that came from this time and it reported X event. And then the X event now means that my salvation hangs on that X event happening. And then they look for confirming events to like support that. And they say, okay, well, that is the only way, because X event is confirmed by these texts that we found. And I wanted to ask you if you could explain, because this, when I was reading your book, kind of like helped me develop this in my own mind. How would you explain that even the Old Testament leading up to some of those events was fabricated to begin with, so that some of those texts that we're looking at, albeit they are texts from a certain period, may have been fabricated or based on false information? How would you just try to like summarize that, I guess, to the lay person who doesn't understand that some of these texts are on fabricated foundations to begin with?
All right. Yeah. Well, the Old Testament is kind of the foundation. It was adopted even by the Christians because they had to, kind of grandfather it in there, or grandfather themselves in there. But it's been questioned for many years, and in the book Secret History and online, there is my little mini series called Who Wrote the Bible? And in there, I report, all the different terrible things that happen to people who question things in the Bible, because the Bible is supposed to be the inerrant, divinely inspired Word of God. And people who just pointed out, maybe Moses didn't write that, because all these things kept saying, that it has been that way to this day. There's never been a prophet like Moses to this very day, which is written by somebody who is living in a time, far removed from the time of Moses. Moses lived a long time ago, and there's been nobody like him since to this very day. So that's long. So obviously Moses didn't write that. And of course, the story about Moses dying and basically being buried by God, so to speak, and disappearing, couldn't have been written by Moses. So the people who just pointed out these minor points were persecuted massively. And then when people started talking about, well, in the Bible, it says there were 2 of something here, and then another version of it tells there was 14 of the same thing here, the doublets, the triplets, so on. So they were really reading this text, and they weren't stupid people, and they were noticing that there were a lot of problems with the text. And at some point, they kept coming up with more and better explanations for why that was so. I mean, generally, it's not a contradiction. You just have to interpret it properly or whatever. And then Wellhausen came along and said, well, there were 4 different documents, and they were all combined, to make the whole thing. And then there's probably some validity to that idea even to this day. But at the same time, people were tortured, put in prison.
Right.
And I'm not sure that anybody was actually burned at the stake for that, but they were burned at the stake for very similar things. So questioning the Bible has been an iffy proposition for a long time. So for the past 200 years, biblical studies have had a little bit more leeway. So little by little, they've come along, and what biblical studies experts generally do is what's called circular logic. The text says it, and therefore it's true, and then they go around to find some way to prove that it's true, going back to the text, because as a matter of fact, there's almost nothing of what would you call, corroborating information about stuff in the Old Testament. There are, in fact, I think I listed them somewhere earlier today. Well, I'm not going to get into that because it gets too involved. But there was the Merneptah inscription. There are a few Assyrian inscriptions. There is the Tel Dan inscription, and there is the Mesha inscription. And I think that's about it. I think there are like 4 or 5 things that actually attest to the existence of Israel, and most of that is, none of it attests to any of the actual stories in the Bible. So we know that an entity called Israel, came in and out of existence, but it had nothing to do with Jerusalem or Judea. That was a much later emergence of a claimed history. So, and what it referred to, for the most part, was the kingdom of Omri and Ahab. And I've always had suspicions that Omri must have been a kind of an Egyptian kinglet, because during the time that all of this was supposed to be going on, there are records that show that Egypt was in control of the whole region. There was no, David and Solomon empire. There was no big temple. There none of that existed. So these are the things that have come out from archaeological studies, and of course it wasn't until much longer after biblical studies started that the discoveries were made of of the great libraries of the Middle East, the Mesopotamian libraries and the cuneiform tablets and all of those things, so that we now know a great deal more about what was going on historically speaking than anybody did when they were just going by the Bible. But somehow the Bible became the shape, the contour, the foundation of everything else. So everything they're doing, they're trying to relate it back to the Bible. They're trying to relate it back to the Bible again and again. And they get into this whole circular reasoning, and they just can't get out of it. So, for example, with anything that has to do with, say, for example, source criticism. And, when you're doing source criticism, you're trying to find out, what's the oldest version of this? Did they get this information from a previous source, an older source? And they tend to want to push back the possibilities as far as they can, because they want that, 10th century confirmation that that's when they started writing the Bible. Well, little by little, over the years, it's moved up. I mean, Wellhausen came along, and then others came along and says, well, it couldn't have been written there. Maybe a few bits of information came from the 10th century, but it really couldn't have been written then because there was no literacy.
Yeah, right.
I mean, and Jameson, who was it? Jameson Drake did an amazing study, showing, the levels of civilized society and literacy and so forth in the whole region. And I don't think his study has been knocked over or refuted. So then they get to the point where, John Van Seters decided that the literature of the Bible was exilic. It was written during the exile. That's even assuming the exile happened.
Right.
See, and that's the problem. Based on the archaeological studies, there was no big transportation of people out, and there was no big return. Things pretty much was all the same throughout the time that they, supposedly they left, or they were exiled to Babylon or whatever, and then, however many years later, after the decree of Cyrus, they all came back. There's no evidence of that leaving, and there is no evidence of that returning. There is no evidence of an exodus from Egypt. There is no evidence of the conquest of Canaan by Joshua. Right. All of these things that are supposed to be situated at certain periods of time, there's no evidence for them. So little by little, they've, come forward to where they're saying that, most of that didn't happen. There might be little seed events in the Old Testament that refer to actual historical things, because there are some. But the stories do not. They tell the story of David and Solomon. They're stand-ins for Omri and Ahab.
Right.
Omri and Ahab lived in a completely different location, and their names were not David and Solomon. First of all, there was a house of David. There's the Tel Dan inscription suggests that there was a tribal group, called the House of David. And that just means house of the beloved, beloved of who? It could have been the beloved of a goddess, for all we know.
Right.
You have to admit how much you don't know. And this is something Niels Peter Lemsch, talks about. You have to admit what you don't know. And once you realize that you don't know really anything, there's almost nothing you can prove, then you're left, everything is suspended on airy nothing. Mm-hmm. So along came Russell Merkin, and this is where we're going to talk to Billy Carson a little bit, because he's concerned about the influence of the Near East on the writing of the Old Testament, and he talks about these. Oh, and I've got these several books. Okay, here we've got this book Well, Russell Gmerkin, and he's a great guy, and he also is not a PhD, but he's considered to be one of the most eminent Dead Sea scholars around, but he's not touting his degrees, right? And he publishes in the academic publishing companies also. And, he's, we've corresponded quite a bit. So anyway, he wrote this book, Plato's Timaeus and the Biblical Creation Accounts. And he points out and demonstrates pretty compellingly that the, Genesis 1 through 11 were strongly influenced by Plato. Okay? And that there was, of course, some mixture of the Mesopotamian legend in there. But by and large, the influence is more strongly Plato's than it is Mesopotamian. Now, Billy might want to read that, okay? And also that the idea of monotheism came to the Jews from the Greeks, from Plato, okay? This whole story, okay? Yeah, we have that one. Yeah, see, my copy.
Yeah, we go.
So we've got Plato and the Creation of the Hebrew Bible, also by Russell Gmerkin. Okay, Baruch and Genesis, Manetho, and Exodus. He goes through the whole shebang and picks out and does a comparative study that is so compelling that once you read it, you can't forget that you've seen it. You can't ever unsee it. Because in some cases, the order of things that were in Plato are reproduced in Genesis or in Exodus, because he talks particularly, or Numbers or Deuteronomy. The whole Pentateuch is influenced by the Greek. Okay, so there's no Jehovah, Yahweh, monotheistic religion that goes all the way back to the 10th century or even earlier. There's no Abraham. There's no Moses. It's all a put-up job. And the other interesting point that Russell makes is that the writing of the Old Testament actually follows the plan laid out by Plato of how the perfect society could be created. They should have a religion, they should have beliefs, they should have ideas and ideas. Everything is all done in a history that goes together. And if you look at the history of say, for example, Kings and Chronicles in the Old Testament, which is the history of the monarchy. It's
right.
It's very anti-king, and it's more for philosopher priest, which was the whole thing that Plato was all about. You got to have these philosopher priests. They're in charge of your society, because that's the only way to have a good society. It's the only way it's going to work. So they created jobs for themselves. So I wonder why I'm getting feedback.
Here,
so
I want to say a few things about Gmerkin.
Yeah, I love.
So I'll want to relate this back to the Huff Carson talk, because one of the things that they mentioned right at the beginning was the Enuma Elish. So Laura kind of briefly alluded to this when she was talking about Gmerkin's latest book on the Genesis and Timaeus and Critias. So one of the things that just starting with the Enuma Elish, when Carson brought it up, he said, okay, well, but Genesis copies from the Enuma Elish. And then Huff said, well, it's more like it's a response to, or it's kind of an adoption of, but criticism of and changing of the Enuma Elish. Like they're taking some of those ideas and then adapting them for the Jews. And there's some, they're both right. So the Enuma, well, they both agreed on the point that the Enuma Elish did influence Genesis.
Right.
But the thing that Gmerkin points out is that how exactly did that happen? Now, Huff will assume and argue that it's just this kind of cultural memory of the Enuma Elish stories, and that it just created the kind of bedrock. And then the Jews who were writing the Genesis account, they just kind of, they were responding to those ideas that were just in the air. Well, now this isn't what I'm going to say isn't an open and shut case, because that requires some other things to consider. But what Gmerkin shows is that, well, how did they know, or how was this transmitted? Well, there was a Greek writer, I believe it was Berosus, this is the subject of his first book, that basically told the story of the Enuma Elish in a Greek context. So it was this Greek, what was he, like a priest historian or something, priest writer, and he wrote all of the accounts of all of the Eastern people over there, and like all of their myths and history and stories, and brought that to the Greek world. That book was at the Library of Alexandria, and that's how they got it. They got it through, that was filtered through Berosus. And so when they were writing the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, the Genesis account, they had Greek books in front of them.
Right.
Now, that's going to sound crazy to a lot of people, but that's what Gmerkin's books are all about, because what Laura was kind of alluding to is that the dates kind of got sooner and sooner and sooner, because as scholars got over or were able to get through the hindrances and the persecution for asking these questions, they started asking more and more questions, until it gets to the point of Gmerkin. Like, Gmerkin is sitting like on top of an underground like revolution in biblical studies, and it kind of started this newest wave of biblical studies started with Niels Peter Lemke, who Laura mentioned, because he was the first one to say, oh, is the Bible a Hellenistic book? Like, was it written after Alexander the Great? Because when you look at it, like, this is what Gmerkin points out, when you look at it, there is zero evidence for the Old Testament before 272 BC. Zero evidence for the Old Testament as a book, as a writing. There's no other historian that mentions the Bible. There's no other historian that mentions the exact things that are in the Bible. There are some similar stories here and there. Like there's an account of Moses that's maybe, I don't know, prior to 272, but it's completely different than the Bible account. And so what Gmerkin is able to show is that not only was there nothing before 272, but that you can actually find evidence of Greek works in the Bible, Greek works that were written around 272 or thereabouts. So he basically argues, and I think proves, like beyond any reasonable doubt, that the Bible, at the very earliest, it could not have been written before 272. Now, there could have been some things that were incorporated from before then, like, and Gmerkin admits that. He thinks that there were like king lists were used, established king lists of actual history, that there were some probably some of the Psalms were older, that some of the prophetic books were maybe a bit older, and those got incorporated. Because like Laura said, Plato's program was to create a religion, to unify a society, and to incorporate some elements of what they already believed, some of their existing literature, some of their existing stories, some of their existing history, but to place all of that in a new account that would be a constitution, because the Bible is in the Old Testament is interesting in that it is the only non-Greek constitution in ancient history.
Right.
And to show the laws of this new society, and to show the laws in a teaching format using stories, using history, to show what the meaning of the law is, how the law came about, how it's applied. That is a Greek convention. There are so many aspects of, and that's mainly what this book is about, Plato and the creation of the Hebrew Bible, is the account of the laws of the Bible, and how the structure of the books themselves, the purpose of the books as a constitution, the content of them in their laws and in their governance, in the form of government that they provide, they're all Greek ideas that didn't exist in the Near East. When you look at the specific laws, every type of law that is in there, you find a few ancient Near Eastern laws here and there, but the vast majority are Greek laws, or obviously influenced by Greek laws. The punishments are all Greek punishments. Right. The division into 12 tribes. The Greeks had 12 tribes. They divided practically everything about the formation of a people, of a society, in in the Old Testament is Greek, with little flavorings here and there, and even a lot of that Near Eastern history that gets imported is imported, like I was saying about Berosus, through Greeks who were bringing these Babylonian and older ideas for the first time to the Greek world in a Greek translation. They were like the guys that were, that were going out finding old books and traditions off in the East, further east, and then bringing them back to Alexandria or the Greek world, writing them down in Greek so that the people speaking Greek would now know about them. That's the first time the ancient, that era of the ancient world learned of all these things, was through these people bringing these ideas into the Greek. And that's actually how the Bible, the writers of the Old Testament, got those ideas, through Greeks. And Gomurkin lays it all out to the point where I don't think anyone can read his books, like Laura said, and come away thinking, oh well, maybe it was just the Greeks that were borrowing from the Jews. Like the Old Testament must have existed and then just shaped the whole course of Greek history. It's like really unlikely.
So the other thing you have to say then too about this, which is mind blowing, I guess, again, because this is literally unraveling the truth. I was just reading Paul Wallace's new book, which I sent to you guys, which, Paul's a good guy. He's attempting to uncover what happened in Turkey and Armenia and those places. But, this information that we're talking about that came from the Greeks, which is obvious, it's proved, was also then borrowed from previous cultures to them. Right. So there's this chain of information that is being passed on from human civilizational cultures of going back, God only knows, that they're just constantly borrowing from. And we don't really know what the origin, at least in my opinion, I don't think we have any idea really what the origin of anything is at this point.
No, and I don't, well, actually.
Well, Witzel has some cool ideas.
Witzel is good. And what's the name of the woman that wrote Mary
Sedegast?
Mary Sedegast. She has some, really, really furiously interesting things to say about Zoroastrianism and how ancient it actually is. I mean, it goes back to the Neolithic Revolution, according to her, and even according to some linguists who have studied, the language that the early Zoroastrian texts were written in, that they are super ancient. So if you want something really super ancient, even more ancient than Mesopotamian,
right?
Then read Mary Sedegast and her discussion. She's got 2 books that on Zoroaster. And Harrison, you corresponded with her, didn't you, before she passed away?
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, just a little bit though. Just 1 or 2 emails. Yeah.
Yeah, because her books are really hard to get, and well,
I think they're both back. I think they're both back in print now. So the first one was the Plato Prehistorian. That one was out of print, but I'm pretty sure right before she died, her publisher was working on getting it reprinted, and I think it's available now. So I think it's easy to get now. And then her second, what was the book after that?
Oh, I don't remember.
Oh, it was something about Zarathustra. I can't remember the name of it.
Yeah, but I mean, that's really as far back as we can really go, and that's far, far, far. So right. You should, if you want to go far, 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 Sedegast. Okay, right. And then that's basically just beyond the end of the last ice age or something. And then the next thing, if you want to get the next layer, would be Mark Vandermeer's book, Philosophy Before the Greeks. And there is Mario Liverani wrote a short, wonderful little book about, the development of writing in Mesopotamia. And he's another great one to read, Liverani, and Giovanni Garbini, a couple of Italians that are really, really good at some of this, unraveling some of these really ancient mysteries. But Philosophy Before the Greeks, and if you read Philosophy Before the Greeks, you'll come to an understanding of where a lot of so-called occult ideas came from, because some of the ideas from what the Babylonians or Mesopotamians were doing when it came to writing and their word lists and their different kinds of permutations of words and playing with words, that and their observations, it's a fascinating study, and you'll get an idea where some occult magical ideas came from. So, going into all of this material has been really fascinating. And like Harrison said, Witzel's study of the world's mythologies is absolutely fascinating. And of course, I included, excerpts or pieces or discussions of many of these things in From Paul to Mark, because I wanted to give kind of a flow chart of how Christianity came to be, because Christianity, of course, was the next thing. And that, I don't know if we're gonna talk much about Christianity, because right now,
I think we should.
Let me mention really quickly, if you want to know, I mentioned Jameson Drake's archaeological study. I didn't pull his book off the shelf because, if I pull all the books off the shelf that relate to all of this stuff, I'd bring half the library in here.
Yeah. Right.
But we've got Israel Finkelstein and Neil Asher Silberman's research on David and Solomon.
Right.
And The Bible Unearthed by the same authors, Archaeology's New Vision of Ancient Israel, etc. So, there are just so many things, and reading books is probably the best, these kinds of books, academic books, because I want to recommend academic books, because if you read something like Zecharia Sitchin, you're not going to get a really accurate picture. I did some research on him years ago when I was reading this, and I did some research, and I found out that it's not a good source. Just put it that way. There are some fantastic Assyriologists and so forth, and you can get access to books where they publish much of these translations of these ancient texts and so forth, and I have some of them. And the big problem for the average person is most of these books are extremely expensive. How much was this one, Harrison? You remember that?
Over $100 at least, and then I think because it's like hard, it might have been out of print, so I don't know, $200 or something.
Yeah, and then I've got one book that prices at over $1,200, but the reason I have it is because I got a PDF of the images and I printed it. But the books are very expensive, and the more crucially interesting and valuable the information is, it seems, the more expensive the books are. And I don't know if that's deliberate or not, but it seems to be so. So you can
it's because there's the smallest market for them. There's only a couple dozen people that are interested.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I know. It's like my husband's book on hyperdimensional physics. It's considered by the academic publisher to be a bestseller, and that's if they sell 50 copies a year.
Right. Right. Yeah, exactly.
So if Billy Carson really wants to get deeply into these things, then our recommendations would probably do him some good. And I would say that Wesly Huff would be well served by looking into this. And
yeah, but he never will. And people like him will refuse true knowledge. It's not part of it.
Okay, now think about this. Bob Altmeyer, psychologist, professor of psychology or something in Canada, wrote a book called Amazing Conversions. And he talked about how people who grow up in fundamentalist families can, open their minds and see that, maybe Christianity isn't what it's cracked up to be. And then there are people who grew up, in complete atheist families who then convert to Christianity. And he did, IQ assessments on these different people. And I'll come right out and say it, that the people who break away from Christianity coming from fundy households are generally smarter.
Right.
And people who come from atheist households who convert to Christianity are not as intelligent.
Right, it's the opposite. Yeah.
So that there is an intelligence quotient there. But what he pointed out was that the thing about studying Christianity or coming in or out of it is that Christianity came up with the idea that there was a truth and you could know the truth and be set free.
Right.
And that it was important. And when people who are intelligent turn that back on their own beliefs and understanding, they can see the issues. And one of the main issues that I have with the things that Huff was saying, he kept talking about, the four witnesses, and he talked about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Of course, Matthew and he didn't say there were two that were actual witnesses, Matthew and John, and then Mark and Luke were people who were associated with actual witnesses. And that's just simply not true, because all the experts, I think, at this point in time agree that the writings of Paul are the oldest Christian writings, Christianity as we understand it. And Paul doesn't know anything about a Jesus of Nazareth. He doesn't know anything about, Peter denying Jesus. And that would be very handy for him. He was completely at odds with the group of Christians that lived in Jerusalem. I mean, completely. And he said at one point, that they are servants of Satan. He wished they would castrate themselves. He got into some serious polemic against them. And that they were deniers of the cross and a lot of different things. So if all of the books of the New Testament were placed in the proper order, starting with the Pauline writings, and that's, the authentic Pauline writings, and then, moving forward, it would be easy for the reader to see that stuff that Paul wrote was put into the mouth of Jesus. And of course, Mark would be the first gospel, because Mark was written based on Paul, and this has been proven. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, it's been proven. A number of studies. David Oliver Smith did probably the best one, and so you have David Oliver Smith, yeah, Matthew,
Mark, Luke, and Paul.
Yeah, because he shows how Mark used Paul, and then how Matthew used Mark, but in some cases he didn't agree with Mark, so he would leave something out or add something in or change things, and then he would use Paul again himself. And then Luke came along and tried to reconcile Mark and Matthew. John.
Yeah, let me add something about that. That what this relates to something that Huff said in his talk with Joe Rogan. He was talking about Luke and how Luke is an historian writing a biography, and he lays out his methodology on how he went back to the original sources, and he was being a good Greek, historiographer, or and going to the sources. But what Huff didn't really mention is that the majority of the book of Luke is copied from the book of Mark.
Right.
So if you're writing a history, maybe that was a practice of historians at the time, that you just lifted one other guy's book and then added everything else that you learned. But it's actually you'd have to say that the majority came from one source, the book of Mark, and then there was a bunch of other stuff that was added. That was the other stuff, which I don't know the percentage. Maybe it's like 40 to 50% of the book. That might be generous. That isn't based on Mark. did that all come from like 10 different sources or something? Well, I think because he's operating from an apologetic position, the assumption among a believer is that, well, first of well, everything is true. Like it can be proven true to the well. I accept that it's true to the degree that it can be proven true, but everything else is also true. So there might only be evidence that proves certain things, but it's a whole package deal. You have to accept all of it. So it's very hard to do. It's very hard to do critical scholarship when you've made up your mind like that, because really to do scholarship, to be honest, like intellectually honest, you have to be able to say, okay, this may or may not be true. Could go either way. I don't really have a dog in this fight. Okay, let's go to the next one. What about this? True or not? But when you were coming at it from a position of pre-held belief, then it's like every single thing needs to be true, because one goes and then everything else follows with it. Whereas if you can detach yourself from the material, then it's like, oh, well, that's probably not true. Oh, this might be true. Oh, and you can actually be, it's a lot more freeing to be able to think like that, where not everything has to be true. The world isn't going to fall apart. Well, maybe part of your world will fall apart because it's become a huge part of what makes you. But once you get over that, it's a lot freeing. But just to come back to what Laura was saying about Paul and the influence. So on this book here that she alluded to, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Paul, David Oliver Smith, again, not a PhD. Well, he's a JD. He was a lawyer. He's retired now, and his obsession post retirement was figuring out some mysteries in the Bible. Kind of like Kamerkin. But he describes one of the things, or he describes the discovery that was kind of an accidental discovery that led him to realize how much of the Gospels were based on Paul, and that was this little bit in Mark, where I'll try to describe it as as simply as possible. But basically, there was something that kind of reminded him of Paul, and it might have been the one that Laura mentioned. But because there's some definite parts in the Gospel of Mark and the rest of the Gospels where you look at it and say, oh, that sounds a lot like what was in Paul. And of course, the previous assumption, because the Gospels come first in the New Testament, is that, oh, Paul was just quoting the New Testament, right? Or quoting the Gospels. But the Gospels didn't exist yet. It's very clear from reading Paul's writings that he has no idea about any of the stuff that's in the Gospels. Paul's letters came first. The Gospels came later, were written after. So there's this part in Mark. This is Mark 12. So that whole chapter. So Jesus is talking to the scribes, and then in the book, there's a quotation from Psalm 118. And then there is an allusion to, or a resonance with, something from Romans 13. And then there's another allusion to 1 Corinthians 15, and then another allusion to 1 Corinthians 15, and then another allusion to Romans 13 again, and then a quote from Psalm 110. And what I forgot to mention about the Psalms quotes is that that Psalm is also quoted in Romans, and that the second Psalm is quoted in 1 Corinthians. Now, the structure that this makes is what's called a chiasm or a chiasm. I don't know the Greek, but basically it's a sandwich structure: A, B, C, C, B, A. So it's this intricate, what would you call it? Just literary convention, a literary structure that is obviously using Paul's work in a very intelligent, like almost in a puzzle-like manner, saying, okay, Paul quoted these Psalms. I'm going to use these Psalms as this layer of the sandwich. And then I'm going to put 1 Corinthians in the middle, because this is the most important part. And then right outside of that, this might be like the lettuce and the tomato. I'm going to put Romans 13, and he sandwiched it all together. And this was for Smith, this was like, oh wow, that's a slam dunk. Like there's no way the author of Mark could just randomly write the same kinds of things that Paul was using, and to use those specific sources in such a clearly, intelligently designed manner. Like this was a structured literary composition. And so then he went through the entire the entire gospel and then other gospels. And that's the product that's what this book is the product of, is every reference and allusion to Paul in the gospels. And so that it's just it kind of shows just how influential Paul was on the gospels, because that's kind of again, it's one of those areas that has been probably remarked upon and written about to a certain degree here and there for little bits, but I think the degree of it hasn't been really known until now, and Smith for a large part discovered it. And it's not just Smith. So like we mentioned, if people like Smith doesn't have a PhD in biblical studies, but there are biblical scholars who are pointing out the same things. And Laura quotes, I'm pretty sure she quotes all of them from Paul to Mark. Like we've got all the sources collected in there. So one of them is Troels Engelberg Peterson, who's a Scandinavian scholar, written again a few like really interesting books on Paul. And he points out some of the same things. I can't remember the specific quote or the specific reference and quotation, but he's reading the Gospels, and then he says, "Wow, this sounds like Paul wrote it." And he points out just how clear the reference is, the internal reference. So I'll just repeat something that Laura says in her book, and that is that the order of the texts in the New Testament, it's very misleading. Not necessarily intentionally so. There's probably an order, a reason why they put the Gospels first, and then Acts, and then the letters. But if you actually put them in what a roughly chronological order, then things get a lot clearer. You see, okay, if I'm just going to clear my mind of all the assumptions I have about Christianity and just look at Paul's letters and say, okay, so this is what's going on. Again, leaving out everything else I think I know. Then you can form a picture. Okay, well, here's the stuff that's in Paul. Then you start with the first gospel, Mark. And then you compare those. What new has been added? What has been carried on and borrowed from Paul? And then you read, because the biblical order is Matthew, Mark, right? Save Matthew for after Mark, because then after you read Mark, you can read the other gospels and say, okay, well, this changed. Well, that's interesting. Like, why is that slightly different like that? Well, it seems like there are intentional differences, some small, some bigger than others. And then you get a whole different picture about what's going on in early Christianity. Because like I said at the very top of the show today, that first century of Christianity is super murky, way murkier than a lot of biblical scholars want to admit, because there's not a lot to go on. It's so bad and so murky that there are some of the really radical scholars who think that every book in the New Testament was composed in the 2nd century, like even the Gospels or even the letters of Paul, because I mean, we don't have, like even Huff will admit, we don't have manuscripts from the 1st century. The first manuscript we have is that excerpt from John, which is conventionally dated to the beginning of the 2nd century. I don't know exactly how narrow those error bars are, but conceivably, if we were to just take like an absolute minimalist view, we could say, well, there really is no evidence, like no biblical evidence in that first 100 years. I mean, that kind of leaves it really open. But of course, that's not really how the conventional and like apologetic stance will see it. They're going to fill that in because it all has to be true. It all has to have occurred and happened the way they think it does, or else that entire edifice of their faith is at risk of falling down. And that's tricky.
Laura and Harrison, I wanted to ask you guys. So I love this because we're kind of like putting threads together. So Plato leads to Old Testament, leads to construction of civilization based on tenets of laws, like you said, Constitution. Okay, then we have this iteration of Paul, pretty similar, not like a whole entire Constitution, but kind of like a framework for like, this is the nature of maybe a spiritual life, how it would look. And then you have Gospels following that. So is this just like 1.0, 2.0 to where we were having, okay, so like we have Plato, he creates this story, which is then used to construct laws and basically like a framework to build a society around, to more or less manage people, control people, enslave people, if you're conspiratorial. Okay, now we have Paul come along. I would say just my own reading, the literary architecture of Paul is much, much more advanced than you would see in the Gospels in terms of its syntax and everything, just, reading it in English at least. So chronologically, like you were saying, Harrison, we have Paul first, then the Gospels after. Well, are the Gospels kind of like the iteration of filling in the story to now build the construction of civilization for the next 1,000, 2,000, we're talking about today, years, to where it's like the story that now governs how we live society? I don't know, but it seems like if you're looking back to Old Testament, New Testament, it kind of makes sense.
That would be a really conspiratorial view, because, and here I'm going to say it, Paul brought ideas to us that are actually good for us.
Right.
And the Gospels, the Gospel of Mark was almost purely a Pauline gospel. And it was written as a metaphor for Paul's teachings. It was written to be read to people who were illiterate, and the people at the time understood that it was a metaphor. They did not think of it as an actual story of a Jesus of Nazareth. That's the thing that comes out very clearly in the studies. And I hope people will read my book, because I have put everything in, every single piece of evidence that exists for, the first 100 years of Christianity is in that book. And there's a whole lot of background even before I get into the Christian evidence, so that or you can figure out what the influences were and where it came from. But Paul wanted us to understand that we are spiritual beings.
Right.
And, his whole idea of Christ on the cross, there are a lot of people who interpret this as, the shame thing, but that wasn't what Paul had in mind at all. For him, Christ on the cross was a triumph. It was triumphant. It was the triumph of the Spirit obeying God despite any physical manifestation to the contrary. Paul's Christ, and we don't even know that he was called Jesus necessarily, except from the Philippians hymn, went to his death willingly to demonstrate that the spirit, the soul, the hyperdimensional realm,
right,
is more real and more important than the physical body, which, whatever. And before I forget it, Huff mentions the Corinthian evidence, so supposedly of 400 people, saw Jesus. He was walking around. Well, it's pretty well established by some very good biblical scholars, established in my opinion, because I've read their work, that this particular part of Paul was an interpolation. And there are many parts of Paul that have been interpolated, which have corrupted what he was trying to say and what he was trying to do. And people who are experts in these kinds of studies can detect those interpolations.
right.
Not all, but most of them can be detected, because, it's like there are study techniques, and this is what a lot of people who do do their kind of like homegrown research don't understand, that there are tools, methodologies. And of course, Huff was talking all the time about methodology. Well, let me tell you what, there is a lot more to methodology than Mr. Huff has ever dreamed, or he has certainly ever used. And if you use these tools and these techniques, you can find these interpolations, and you can realize that there's a whole lot of stuff that's been added into. And in some cases, some Pauline letters have been cut up in pieces and put together in new and novel ways. All of that's discussed in my book.
Right.
Every bit of it. So, but the thing is you need to realize that Paul never mentions John the Baptist. never says anything about the betrayal by Judas or Peter's denial of Jesus. And this should be a surprise, since Paul was in direct conflict with Peter and the Jerusalem church. And that even comes through in, I believe it's in Acts, which we don't consider to be necessarily a historical document, but it also is in the Pauline letters. So when you can find something that corresponds between Paul and these other writings, then you can figure that there's some kind of a seed of truth going in there. There are many occasions when Paul could have cited Jesus to settle an issue, but he never does that.
Right.
Paul contradicts what the Gospels say in some instances, but more often on all the material that is written in Mark and then copied from Mark into Matthew and Luke, Paul, the Gospels are putting Paul's words into Jesus' mouth. Paul doesn't write anything about 12 apostles, as described in the Gospels and Acts, and the single mention of them in the epistles lacks any specific detail. And what it does say contradicts the Gospels. And that's another thing. I mean, when Huff cites the 400 witnesses, that was supposedly in Paul's letters, but it was an interpolation. That's never in the Gospels.
Right.
Okay. Paul only knew Cephas, James, and John, the pillars of the Jerusalem church, and he was in conflict with them. And he was in conflict with Peter. The incident of the food incident where Paul, lambasted Peter because he was, you were a good guy, and then now you wanted to eat separately. What's going on? James appears to be the one who was insisting that the law was the only way to be a Christian. Paul talks all the time throughout his letters of Jewish plots and conspiracies against his converts. And he mentions the gospel of circumcision, which is evil. And that's, when he starts talking about he wishes they would castrate themselves. And he says they're proclaiming another Jesus. And he said that the Jerusalem Christians were enemies of the cross of Christ. He never mentions or alludes to the idea that any of the apostles had ever been companions of an earthly Jesus. When he talks about James being the Lord's brother, it's fairly obvious from other references that he's talking about like a member of a group or a sect, such as the Jerusalem Christians. Nowhere does he ever suggest that Peter, James, and John, or Cephas, James, and John were taught anything by a Jesus. They were simply leaders of a sect in Jerusalem. So, there is something really, really wrong with this picture. And since scholars continue to exist, there was a Jesus of Nazareth as depicted in the gospel somewhere behind it all. And that the Gospels relied on oral traditions or sayings, Gospels to construct their stories. Paul obviously never heard of any of those things.
So Laura and Harrison, if we dig deeper into this, and thank you for that explanation, Laura, but if we dig deeper into this from a Greek standpoint, we know that Christ was the Christos, meaning the anointed one, or to anoint. So if we even drill deeper from there, because going back to what Harrison said, we know this is the work of Greek philosophy or Greek historians or history. What does the cross of Christ truly actually mean? Like, what do we interpret that if it wasn't really this Jesus of Nazareth character, and they were speaking about a general principle of the cross of Christ or the Christos or the anointed one? What was Paul really attempting to make known about it?
Well, what I think and what I wrote in the book.
Yeah,
I'm not sure that it would take a lot of explanation to explain why I came to the conclusion I did, because I worked my way to it.
right.
I follow the texts, and I just follow them. But for Paul, a cross was a symbol of triumph. And on the front of the book, pull the book, show the picture on the front. That's a denarius from the time of Julius Caesar, I think. Isn't it?
Yeah,
Most likely.
I can't remember for sure, but it's on the copyright page. If you want to see, it should have the date of the coin on the copyright page.
Yeah, find that and read it out. Because I picked it for a specific reason. It's to give them a message. It's highly symbolic.
45 BCE, Spanish Mint.
Yeah, so 2 years before Caesar was
The
assassinated.
denarius of Julius Caesar. Yeah.
And
It was a Gallic military trophy with a captured Gaul on one side and a mourning female symbolizing Gallia defeated on the other.
See the triptych. Oh, go ahead, Harrison.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I was just going to say the same thing and a bit more without spoiling the book. The cross shape that we have is the shape of a Roman trophy or tropeum or tropheum. It's 2 bars, and then you'd hang the armor of your defeated enemies on it, or
Right.
other trophies. That's why it was called a trophy, a tropeum. So it's interesting that the shape of the cross matches the Roman trophy. Interesting, but I would add one more thing, that for Paul, like one of the main metaphysical spiritual themes of Paul is this dying and resurrection, this crucifying, this suffering and being reborn. It's this psycho-spiritual process. So I would say if we bracket off the historical claims for a moment and just look at what Paul was teaching and what he lived and was teaching in a very like one-on-one and personal manner, like someone's actual spiritual development. It was an internal spiritual psychological process of dying and being reborn, of having like a new self, of your old selfish self being crucified, and what remained was the spirit, which then grew within you, grew to the point where
Right.
all of the bad stuff was was taken over by the spirit. And I just add, so for anyone that wants to look a bit deeper into that, there are 2 books I'd recommend. One by a guy we already mentioned, Troels Engberg Peterson, called Paul and the Stoics, where he points out that the structure of Paul's psycho-spirituality, the internal structure of it, is remarkably similar to that of the ancient Stoics, the Greek and Roman philosophers Stoics. And then the other one is Laura, you're gonna have to help me out on this one. What's the Paul's Necessary Sin by what's the author of that? Okay. Well, that's the title of it. I can't remember the author's name off the top of my head.
Ashworth.
Yeah, Timothy Ashworth. Paul's Necessary Sin. And so that deals with it just looking at Paul. Like, he doesn't get into the Stoics at all, but comes to the same conclusion about the structure of that process. So when we're talking about the meaning of the cross, like the actual inner meaning for an individual, who in Paul's time would be called, not called a Christian, because that word didn't exist yet, but a follower of Christ, a brother of Christ, to be one of that community. That's what the process was. That's what the inner process was the crucifixion of everything like sinful and impure within oneself, to then only do God's will, and God's will being the highest will. And when that happens, there's an extreme strength and strength and what's the word? To describe Paul, like if you look at Paul and the way he describes himself, he was tenacious. Like he was nothing would stop that guy. He would travel like to the extent of the Roman Empire. He would get in fights. He would get he wasn't imprisoned several times. So it was that process for him, and for those who do the same, experience the same thing. It gives them a strength and a will to do more than their body or their past self would have, allowed themselves to. So it's to kind of transcend the limits of the body and the emotions and the lower personality that hold people back, and to actually, in his terminology, to do God's will.
So Lauren Harrison, would it be too far of a stretch to say the rebirth is really moving from a service to self, STS being, into being a service to others, being in third density that is a candidate for graduation into fourth density service to others? Kind of sounds similar if you think about crucifying that nature within you that is a base desire to only gratify your own needs, your own desires, to move into a service to others. Because when you do that, like Paul said, and I think we could argue that people watching and all of us on this call, the tenacity comes when you have an orientation to be of service to others rather than just gratifying your own needs.
Yep.
Yeah, I think those words, like the words that you used and the words that we use, they're different words for the same thing. So
Right.
Paul used his words, we're using our words, and there's some idiosyncratic usage of words, but they're the concept and the actual thing that they're describing is, in my mind, the same thing.
Yeah, and I just tell y'all that Harrison wrote that section of the book where
Did I? I can't remember.
Well, he wrote a lot of it. I went through and edited it down because it was really long. But yeah, he did that section where we were talking about Paul's theology.
Oh yeah.
So
well, it's interesting to examine his theology. Kind of like when I first read Secret History, I didn't have the context to understand it. To examine Paul through the lens of hyperdimensionality, so the understanding, of it made so much more sense to me reading Laura's book and then understanding the wave and understanding hyperdimensionality of what he was talking about, and to go conspiratorial, maybe why that was convoluted or, moved into or eschewed into another understanding, which eventually became like the Roman Catholic Church and then this political structure that was perpetuated. It kind of makes more sense, because if you look at what he's saying about the nature of reality and hyperdimensions, I think the same way that we talk about it, to where it's not, I guess, how's the best way to say it? It's not cool to people or to entities that understand that we talk about that, I guess. That's why Laura's been so, maligned, and so much disinformation has been put out around her. And I think, back then to Paul, was he kind of onto the same breadcrumb trail that we're
Just
on.
FYI, Laura, you're being maligned and attacked as I block and ban people left and right here. This call, it's insane, the amount of haters.
Yeah, it's just there's
You can, people, it's the Jack Nicholson, Tom Cruise. It's not even a matter of handling the truth. They don't want the truth. It's no matter how much scholarship or how much evidence or gnosis or research you do to get it, they want to just stand up on their bully pulpit and tell you that's not true. That it's only this way. Just like you were saying, Harrison, with the fundies. I mean, they just cannot hear the idea that what they think is right might not be.
yeah.
And I mean, I've got sympathy for that, because if you think about the size of religion just in culture, I mean, we've got 2,000 years of history, and for a lot of people in a lot of situations, everyone around you.
Right.
And it's
right.
Here is everything you have to believe. And there's a list of all the things that you have to believe.
Right.
And if you just disagree with one of them, that's enough. Like Laura was saying about maybe Moses didn't write the first 5 books of the Bible. That could be enough. It's just that one little question. And then what I think about, one of the unfortunate things is that, let's say that happens, and then you get rejected by your whole family. This happens to a lot of people in let's say maybe the Jehovah's Witnesses or something. You question one thing and then you're out, right? And then that can just push you way too far into the other direction, right? And then you become this hardcore militant atheist. When we don't have to be either of those.
Right.
You know,
Right.
we can have reasonably held beliefs that are, you know, not
Rational.
too tightly held, because rational, basically it's okay to question things. It's okay not to be sure about things. It's okay to say maybe this is right, maybe it's wrong, I'm not quite sure. Like, you're not going to go to hell for that. That's
Right.
like, if anything, I think the intelligence of the universe and God, like, wants you to know it. And part of knowing is questioning, not being sure, because we're humans. We don't know things for sure.
Right.
Like, there's very few things we can know for sure.
Right.
So maybe that's okay, you know.
Laura, I want to ask you kind of like of the psychological aspect, because I know you've written on this and studied deeply. The psychological aspect of someone that, like you're saying, is like either converted to Christianity. So if you go into the comments of like Joe Rogan and Wesly Huff talking, there's a lot of people, who knows if their bots are real or whatever, but there does seem to be a sentiment of people that are like, I was an atheist, or I was like a very materialist, and I heard Wesly Huff, and now I'm a converted Christian. I'm saved. I have salvation. I know there's some people in my own life that, you know, like I'm friends with from when I'm younger. They maybe were like raised Christian or maybe not. And then they kind of hear these things. And now that they're older, they have children, they kind of like want to like orient this kind of like inclination to do the right thing into Christianity. And then Wesly Huff comes along and gives them tools to be able to do so.
Sure.
So I forget what book it is in the wave, but you mentioned in the 1970s, there were televangelists.
It's book 6. Book 6.
Yeah. Book 6. I think it was Facing the Unknown, maybe Petty Tyrants. I can't remember, but you mentioned that there were televangelists, and kind of like with the green bomb thing, there would be these catchphrases, and it would like hypnotize people into following a certain way. And then all of a sudden they just have marching orders, like unbeknownst to anyone else, that they're just like, boom, there. I can't help but wonder, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. If someone like a Wesly Huff, these people come along,
same thing,
and then there's like a catchphrase they say to some people on a podcast or something, and then it like takes maybe 10 million people listen to the podcast, and there's 20,000, maybe even less, maybe 20 people that hear that, and all of a sudden, boom, they're like now have these marching orders that they go out and they like start behaving in these certain ways and doing certain things. Do you think that is plausible, or even something that could be going on? Because it just makes me think back to like those televangelists from the 70s. It's like 2.0, you know, again, here we are 2025, and it's just
Laura, before you answer that, I mean, obviously I know you and Harrison, unfortunately, I don't think you were in this email, but we can prove that the algorithm rewarded that podcast in ways that are unexplainable based on the way the algorithm usually works. Because again, Wesly Huff at that point was basically an unknown. From a
data standpoint, Harrison, can't remember if you saw the email. He had at the end of November 2024, his total channel had 250,000 views, which is very low in terms of like YouTube.
It's nothing.
Views. Yeah. And as of like last week or whenever I checked on it in an analytics platform, he had 15 million. So like, just to know that like, you only get that, like, not from creating content, but like there is assistance from the algorithm, point-blank period, of like that pushes that, whether it's through like comments or like suggested videos or whatever. So just to give you like the backstory on that, it is a statistical anomaly, I guess you could call it. So,
well, what I would say about Wesly is he's a clean-cut looking young man. He's articulate, mostly articulate. And to me, he's a typical biblical apologist. I mean, he's really typical. But as to why it would be received in such a popular way, maybe there's some manipulation of an algorithm, but there's also the fact that the world is in the condition it's in, and people are really feeling very uncomfortable with the way things are.
Yeah.
And also there are a lot of people, I mean, probably a couple of generations that haven't been going to church.
Right.
And they haven't read the Bible, and they don't know anything about it. So they are really completely like blank slates.
Right. They're too, yeah.
And they don't know anything about biblical studies. So when they see a presentable fellow who's very sincerely talking about, oh, there were 4 witnesses and there were
What
4
he thinks. Yeah.
witnesses, and they're willing to believe, the most minimal signs of authority, and he's speaking with authority. He's talking about his studies, and he whips out his piece of cut up papyrus, to show you how hard he's studying, because he cut all these little pieces out with an X-Acto knife, and that's proof of how dedicated he is and how knowledgeable he is, because he's got these things, in these little glass frames. So, that's kind of like waving his authority, which is kind of a hypnotic action, his words, his repetition. But basically, people are they're hungry for something. And maybe they're being manipulated to go in that direction. I don't see it as a very profitable direction for some people, but on the other hand, for people who don't have the intelligence or the inner will or fortitude, intestinal fortitude, to really ask questions and go out on limbs, and who don't have the intellect to deal with things like hyperdimensional space or whatever, that might be more comfortable for them. But when we're talking about the hyperdimensional reality and the potential occupation of that reality by denizens that are hyperdimensional, i.e. aliens, beings with really stupendous abilities and powers, who may or and probably will be introduced into our reality in the not too distant future. Because if you listen to what's being said by whistleblowers and military people, and what's going on in like that field right at this present time, a lot of people that's scaring some people, because they want to go with the, oh my God, I've got to get Jesus, because if I don't get Jesus, the aliens are going to get me. Or conversely, Jesus is an alien,
right?
Which is even worse. And they don't understand that what we've traditionally called aliens, demons, and vampires, or other types of creepy creatures, probably were hyperdimensional beings interacting with our reality. And so that's not so wrong. But the problem is that they've always been doing that. I mean, the records are there back through history. So is going into another mythical space going to be in our best interests to deal with something that is partly material and partly ethereal, and probably a whole lot technological, even if that technology is partly material and partly ethereal? I don't think that going into the, jumping back into the old time religion and, thinking that you're going to pray it away is going to be necessarily good for you. Because, I mean, it's like religion is telling people that predators are really just rabbits.
Mm-hmm.
If you pray to Jesus, it'll be a rabbit and it won't bother you. Well, let me tell you, it's a predator, and they have abilities, and people need to know and understand these and know how to deal with them. I know you got something to say, Harrison.
Yeah, I just want to. Well, I'll preface this by saying that, from my personal opinion, like the Wes Huff type of Christian is, to me, like one of the most least offensive, because I can think of a lot worse that people can do than to get behind like some of the, like you were mentioning, televangelists, Hunter. Like there are levels of Christianity, and I think his represents a pretty reasonable one, and I think that on the whole, that's better than a lot of alternatives. because I like to think practically about religion. And unfortunately, the way it is, we have major religions and they're not going anywhere. So we have major subdivisions and factions of religions. So we've got like the Eastern Orthodox Church, we've got the Catholic Church, we've got more of like the American variety Protestantism. They're not going anywhere. And like, so in Russia, for instance, they've got their Eastern Orthodoxy. That's not going anywhere. That's going to be the framework for a lot of people. And it's going to be different in the US. It's going to be different in like some of the Catholic countries. I think that given that reality, that on the ground reality, the best thing that can be done is to find a way within those structures to get as close to the reality as possible, of an understanding, close to an objective understanding, maybe within that framework. Of course, it's not going to be perfect, but it can be done, I think, at least relatively effectively. And so, for instance, in the kind of American, in the American Christian milieu, an example I like to turn to is a guy like Timothy Alberino.
Yeah.
Right. And he's a Christian, he's a believing Christian, but he's got a really good framework for looking at like UFOs and aliens. Like he's pretty on point, I think, in the way he looks at it. He's got his own like Christian interpretation that's kind of, I don't totally agree with, but when it comes to just the fundamentals, like I imagine I could have a conversation with him and we'd be on the same page about, what to think about it and what to do about it. So that's just what I'd add about just religion in general. Of course, it's going to apply also to, Islam and Hinduism and all that. Like ideally, we would be able to find a kind of a way of framing things that is compatible with a lot of those religions, to at least try to get humanity on the same page on some very basic fundamental ideas.
Harrison, hoping maybe we can get your Substack. Send
it to him. Yeah.
I'm sure he does.
He needs to. He should. Everyone should. One question I have for you, Lauren Harrison, is just to give you like a origin of like where this question in my head came from. At nighttime, I usually like to read fiction books before I go to bed. I was at Barnes & Noble and I picked up one called The Alchemist. Seemed pretty cool. And I started reading through it, and like the big narrative of the story, it's like a young adult fiction book, but I didn't know when I picked it up. I was like, oh, that looks like a cool cover. But the secret of like The Alchemist is there's these like kids, and this alchemist who's supposed to be like Fulcanelli alive in modern times teaches them that the like main lesson that they have to understand is that they are food. And I was like, whoa, this is kind of crazy that like, everything I've read from Laura's work is like, we are food for hyperdimensionals. In so many words, like he's saying that through it. And I wonder, it made me think like, when will a religion, because I agree with Harrison that I think that we're here and it's kind of like the nature. It's kind of like saying the sky is blue. Religion exists in the world. But at what point will it ever be? I think like one of the biggest disclosures would be, does religion admit to people or teach people or ascribe to them that we are food? And I think like not acknowledging that would be kind of like turning a blind eye to what's really going on. And like you were saying, Laura, like the more we run from this, you cannot not acknowledge that fact. And you like to what you were saying, like we're prey, and to say that like Jesus is a rabbit means that you're like not going to get eaten, right? Meanwhile, like physically and energetically, we're food. So do you think that religion would ever get to the point where they acknowledge that, or is that kind of like the purpose of it is to like move people away from the understanding that they're food?
Oh, that's a tough one, because that's something that if people don't come to understand that, they have no defenses. The only thing I can say is at the present time, people are probably safer within a religious structure than in a materialist structure. I can say that. But, different, obviously I did all this work on Paul because I think Paul had it right. He was, and he understood the demonic world, and the world of spirits and so forth. and he understood the need for communities of people who knew and understood these things, and making yourselves inedible. And that's something the Cassiopaeans have talked about. They talk about if you make yourself inedible, if you change your frequency,
Right.
you become inedible. Now, there's the possibility that people can change their frequency and become inedible within a standard religious framework. Simply by the purity of their thoughts and deeds and inclinations and intentions. So, in a certain sense, yeah, just your standard religion can, enclose you, encompass you, and even to a certain extent save you. So, I'd rather see people in religions of a benevolent sort, the kind like what Harrison was describing, than to see them denying spirituality or, adhering to, basically a satanic delusion. So, yeah, it would be better, but obviously there are always going to be different levels of people, and there are going to be people who can't do any more than being in a standard religion.
Yeah.
And there are going to be people who are going to know more and want more, and who are going to look at things in a different way. And ideally, our reality should be able to accommodate those different levels. I mean, at least with Trump in power, supposedly. So,
well, to all of your guys' points, and to Hunter's too, like, my argument with religion, and again, I was raised Catholic and walked out when I was 6 years old, but obviously I still am involved in that with my family when there's funerals and all that kind of stuff. But like, looking at it through the Catholic lens, I see too many of them, if not all of them, and I shouldn't say all, but most, like their idea of spirituality is going to mass on Sunday and standing up and taking the Eucharist and saying the prayers and the chants and, all the mind control that's going on in that. And then thinking they can just go back to their life and being in service to self and, the rat race, and it's, what's in it for me. And so that's like my concern. Like, I really think that, to what you were saying, Harrison, and obviously what you just said too, Laura, is like, it's more than just being in a religion. Cause then I think about my brother Joey, who hopefully he watched the show tonight, because I told him to watch it. He's in a group, and, he considers himself a Bible scholar, and he's a really intelligent person. I think I've read to you, Laura, some of the things that he said in the past, but he likens religion to, like, it's the way of, right thinking, benevolent, moralistic, virtuous cultures, because it teaches laws and commonalities on, the golden rule and thou shalt not kill, and, all those things. And I get that. And I respect that, it's going back to what Harrison was saying of a benevolent type of religion, but I still think that people have to work, going to your works, Laura, that people have to work on themselves. And they have to really, truly understand that the battle is within, and the job is within, the journey is within, and it's not without, it's not external. And I just see this third density culture in almost every form and format as teaching people some form of an external savior, and again, we don't have to get into that and drill down. Again, if you guys haven't read Laura's books, The Wave, it's, in my opinion, it's so critically important that you immerse yourselves in that and learn about that, because again, it's about, transformation of the soul, the transformation of your inner self or your higher self, or however you want to look at it from your views and beliefs. And I just think that too many people use, quote unquote, their religion as a crutch, and that by going on Sundays and, singing the hymnals and the Psalms, that they're spiritual, when they don't truly live anything of that type outside of being in that church for an hour or 90 minutes or whatever every Sunday.
well, Jay, there's always going to be people like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, even within the Catholic Church, there's a very mystical pathway for those who want it, or
Sure.
within probably any denomination, there's a mystical pathway.
Yeah.
so I don't think you can save those people. Like, you can't
Yeah.
save people who are hating on you or hating on me or hating on whatever.
Yep.
And the C's have said, that there are going to be a lot of people that are not going to make the transition. They're not going to make the graduation. And, we just have to accept that that's the way it is. I mean, in the Christian religion, it's saying, some people are going to go to heaven and some people aren't. That's, in a certain sense, that's true across the board, no matter how you're looking at the spiritual framework that you're working with.
Right.
We can't do anything about that. What I've been doing all these years is I have just been researching, writing, and putting it out there. It's out there in book form. I appreciate it when people buy my books. But you know what? It's also out there for free on the internet because I put it there. And so it's there. If somebody's looking for it, they'll find it.
Laura, can I ask you a question? You mentioned something in one of the emails, and it got me thinking because we'll think about this sometimes. Not that it really matters, but do you think there is a certain minimum IQ that someone would need to have to understand hyperdimensions? Like you were saying, those people that can't be saved. Do you think, I'm not saying that it's for all of them, but do you think there's an IQ? Because a lot of times when we talk about this, like I didn't understand that when I was younger, but I came to understand it and it informed my consciousness and reality and experience here more. And so like when I was younger, it was not necessarily that I was dumb, but I just hadn't got to the point of like learning that. It's like, oh, okay, like that makes sense. And I can connect the dots now. But if I was like looking at my younger self, I wouldn't say I was stupid just because I didn't understand that. But I like was able to expand my awareness to the point to where I grasped that concept. But do you think like those people that can't be saved, do you think it's an IQ thing to like where they'll never be able to understand it?
No, I don't think it's an IQ thing. I think it's how much of what you have is devoted to, what is necessary. I mean, if you look at Steve Mithen, he writes this really interesting book about it's called Prehistory of the Mind, and he brings forward different theories of mind, and what he calls the Swiss Army knife theory of the mind, which is the different parts of the brain are learning to do different things, and somebody can be, a fantastic artist, whatever, but be inarticulate in trying to explain what they're doing. They can be a great mechanic, but they can't explain it to anybody else. They can show them, but they can't talk about it. So, they're limited in their part of their brain that's devoted to speech, and they're big in the part of their brain that's devoted to doing whatever it is they do. So maybe there is something like this in a spiritual sense that a person could have a lower IQ and still be perfectly capable of understanding in an instinctive way.
Right.
Hyperdimensionality and spiritual concepts. I've known some people who are not the brightest light bulb in the pack, and they really understood things. They said things that made sense, and they read situations in ways that were really novel and interesting. So I don't think it's like a minimal IQ thing. I mean, IQ certainly is going to have something to do with it to some extent, because if you don't have any IQ, or and here I'm not even sure that IQ is even the right word.
Right.
Well, is this what you're thinking, Laura? I would, the way I would phrase it is that there is a lower limit, but it's at the level of like mental retardation, where it's like at the very bottom of the bell curve. It's like there's probably if it's that low, like below 70 or something, below 75, there's probably certain concepts that are just impossible. And that's not to say that there's no value to those individuals. It's just that something like that would probably be beyond their mental capacity.
They're going to need quite a few more incarnations before they, bring their level up. And that's
right.
That's true of a lot of people that are existing on the planet today. A lot of people are going to need to come back to a kind of do these things over again, because if there's a big cycle change coming along, you know, people are going to go back into a primitive way of life and start the whole cycle over again. And there's plenty of people that I can see around that need to do it.
Yeah, the people that just lost.
Yeah.
Well, that's interesting, Laura. I think about a lot of like the information that's coming out now. So I've got 3 younger brothers. My youngest brother is 19 years old. He's 13 years younger than me. And the way he's able to understand the world now, I wouldn't say he's like as intellectually curious as me, but he's a smart kid. But like I would have never understood some of the concepts he understands at 19 because of the nature of like how information is widespread now. And so like what he has access to that I just didn't have access to. You know, back then when I was in college at 19, like social media, Instagram hadn't really even come out yet. You know, like Twitter wasn't big. And so
totally different world he's in.
Yeah, it was a different world. And like the way we got information back then is different.
And also there's information in the atmosphere, you know, like hundreds monkey effect.
Right.
You know, once something has been done, once something has been understood, then it becomes part of, you know, of everybody's psyche. It becomes part of
the collective. Yeah.
And that's kind of like what the Cassiopaeans did. They took me and expanded my reality, and I just put it all out there. And of course, we've seen hundreds of people who've, you know, copied or plagiarized or, you know, twisted or whatever. But, you know, I can date the concepts we came up with or that were given to us that we explained. So it's all part of the reality now. And I was dumb. I mean, if you look back at some of those early sessions and the really retarded questions I was asking.
Yeah, no doubt. It's hilarious. That's why the book, the Wave series is amazing to see your evolution.
Yeah, because
it's cool too because it's like symbiotic with the reader too. Because like people that don't understand it, they go through and they're kind of like the same level that Laura was in 1994.
That's what I felt like, Hunter, in books 2 and 3. I remember the text going back and forth between you and me. We're like, well, she doesn't know this, but I don't understand this either. So this is fascinating. I gotta go. Sorry, dude. I gotta go keep reading.
Yeah, I've got to make it. I got to make a comment on that, Laura, because there's a few times in your writings where you're like, where you've got, you know, this excerpt and you say, oh, I was such an idiot for, you know, asking these questions, and then I'm sitting there reading, I don't get it. Like, explain it to me. What was the idiocy behind this question?
Exactly.
So that's my one complaint, is that sometimes the reader's right where you are, and it's not helping.
Well, I was kind of like a cross between a fundy and a new ager. And all those fundy and new age concepts were what was crowding my brain. And I made assumption after assumption after assumption. I had to learn, had to be taught, had to be trained to have a beginner's mind and to just let everything go and ask a simple, direct, honest, sincere question. People don't know how to ask questions anymore.
Right.
Ask questions based on assumptions.
Right.
And you can't have that.
Well, back to the point. Hold on, Hunter. I want you to finish because this relates to what you're going to say. But like, don't we maybe all? Because I think of the great Walter Russell's quote. He said, "The journey begins. We come out of the womb into the base of the jungle, and the journey is back to the top of the mountaintop." So, what if all of us have as many incarnations as necessary to get to a level of awareness that once you get there, let's just call it, you're at some form of service to others for the most of the part. I mean, obviously we know we're all service to self, living in a physical body, but what if that is the journey, at least at this level of reality, again, consider it third density, where you have to have so many incarnations to make that ascent, that gradual evolution.
You do. And that's the beauty of it. And also remember that, you know, about 50% are going to graduate to service to self. I mean, we're going to get more and more evil. I mean, the cosmos is a balance. There is 50% service to self, 50% service to others.
Right.
So, you know, there are those that are seeking graduation to, you know, deeper and more prolific evil. And but fortunately, as I understand it, in the hyperdimensional realms or the fourth density, you know, they're not mixed anymore.
Right. It's separate.
So they go into their own hell, if you want to call it, and, you know, continue to contract on themselves.
I know. Think about that. So we don't really talk about that, and I know we're going to get back to you, Hunter. But it's like this is the highest level of reality where we're together,
Yeah.
and so you can actually choose.
Yeah, and that's what we're here for. And that also brings back to the issue of the cross, because the cross is a crossroad. We can choose, you know, whether we follow the right-hand path or the left.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Well,
Amazing show.
I have another question now, but all I was going to say is, I think so. Jay and I see this in the health world now. You have a lot of baby boomers that got a certain protocol in 2021. I won't say it's like the video stays up. It led their health to demise. And Jay and I sometimes are like, all of the evidence out there, how could you continue to do that? Actually, a lot of the people, you know, like in our coaching groups and stuff now, like they came to realize how bad those certain procedures were because of what it did to their health. And now they're like waking up to like alternative health methods.
what
Go ahead.
what kind of procedures?
Like basically you've got that
V.
for, you know, to protect you from the V.
That word where you
Yeah.
where you take one of those things that's supposed to make you immune when you already have an immune system.
Yes, exactly. Sometimes we've had so many Laura, we've had so many videos like shut down if we say that because it picks up in the AI or whatever. But we've seen a lot of people that like, you know, follow us now because they realize how bad that was, and now they're using like alternative methods to attempt to heal themselves. But Jay and I all the time say like maybe that's just like an accelerant into those people's like back onto the reincarnation wheel to like get them out, because like the expansion of awareness is getting to the point now to like where they wouldn't be able to handle what the next, you know, iteration is, and so they like that's kind of like their.
Well, you know, it's funny that you say that because the C's did address that about those things, and they talked about how it can possibly put a limitation on the individual so that they can't progress any further. And that's kind of like really all I'll say about it. People need to read the sessions, and they'll come across that material clearly. Yeah.
What about for the people though? This is for you, Laura, around that, because you know, obviously I agree with you 100%. All of us are in the same agreement. But like, what about the younger people that were forced, like the athletes? You know, the people that like, it was like you lose your scholarship. You know, obviously they're not old enough to discern. They're not making money, because I don't put the people who did it because they were going to lose their job. That's different. I mean, younger people who are in a situation where they're kind of like still, you know, in a situation where like they lose their livelihood.
Well, here I'm just going to fall back on the old explanation that is generally used for that type of situation in the lore or the of reincarnation, which is that you pick your parents and you pick the situation you're going to go into, and you pick the lessons you're going to learn, and maybe the one you need. But what I wanted to say was I read just the other day on X that Bill Gates is now forecasting a black swan event that's going to take out 94. Get that number, 94 of the population.
Wow.
And I read that, and I says, wow, that's something that C said, you know, like in the very first session, that, you know, 94% of the population is going to, you know, check out.
Wow.
So, or be used, whatever, in some way or another. So, yeah, I wonder how much truth there is to some kind of upcoming event that will wipe out massive numbers of people, whether it's planned or whether they know something that's coming, such as some kind of cosmic interaction, you know, cometary bombardment, or an asteroid, or a true plague. I mean, you know, maybe somebody knows something or they suspect something. So, you know, I hope people are really working on getting healthy and learning as much as they can about their bodies and staying healthy and getting cleaned out, because those are the people that will probably survive.
Right.
If there is such an event in our future. And he said it and Bill Gates said it, so it must be true.
That's crazy.
That's crazy to think that just that number 94, I still remember it was like 94%. And then that was one of those ones, like when I was reading the book, you just kind of like drop the book. You're like, whoa. It just kind of like
94%. What's our population now? 8 billion?
Yeah.
So they say. Who knows?
So, yeah. So
What's 94%? Who's going to bury the bodies? You better learn how to drive a front end loader.
yeah. Well, it's funny to the black swan analogy that guy Nicholas Nassim Taleb, that coined the black swan, and talking about being anti-fragile, which is basically like it's the concept of being whether it's like with your finances or just your life in general. There's certain concepts of like anti-fragility, which means that the more pressure you put on a system, the stronger it becomes. And it's kind of like, well, that's similar to, I think, of like becoming inedible. Like all the practices that we do, the learning, the expansion of awareness is really anti-fragility, because the more system or the more pressure that gets put on that system, the actually like stronger someone becomes. Whereas a lot of people, they have to opt out, and whether they like die or move on or just bury their head in the sand. It's crazy. Wow. Yeah. Wild times.
We're in wild times. We're in unprecedented times. I mean, just in the last week and a half, as you guys know, is everything that's come out with USAID or USAID. I mean, the whole thing was a Ponzi scheme, maybe the greatest Ponzi scheme in the history of mankind, at least in this epoch of civilization, of human civilization. And let's face it, I mean, the people that support that, I won't call them names, but we all know what that name would be. They're dealing with their reality now becoming, unraveled. Like they're dealing with their entire existence being, it's a repudiation of their existence.
If you read Fletcher Prouty, or Prouty, however his name is pronounced, he wrote about all of those things and years ago.
Yeah.
About the CIA and how they, were using these different ways and means to, control literally everything, from media to whatever.
Yep.
Of course, coming out the way it has made it evident to everyone that it was far wider and deeper than we ever imagined.
We had every level of civilization.
How they could get away with 9/11 being an inside job and cover it up. We understand how they could get away with assassinating John Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King and whoever else, and how they have destroyed governments around the world. And I mean, it's just astonishing. It's just, I mean, that was a mother lode. It wasn't the ultimate mother lode of information, because I think they're going to find out a whole heck.
That's what I was just going to ask you. So you guys, we've been on here for 2 hours and 7 minutes, and this has been amazing. And I'm really grateful for both of you for being here. And of course, all you amazing people. We've had over 500 people watching, actually much more on LinkedIn and Instagram. But just as a bonus question for both of you, it's all coming out. I mean, what further comes out, we can only guess. But do you guys see, because this is, I think, the question that people, the quote unquote normies in the street really have. We now know about the graft. We know about the wanton misuse, I mean, blatant, theft. I mean, just blatant criminality across the board. I mean, are any of these people actually going to be prosecuted? Are they going to face, criminal charges, fines, or is it, because I could make an argument at this point that they're almost just like pushing it into our face, and that the quote unquote elites, political class, cabal, whatever you want to call them, are still all together. There's no sides, and they're just pushing it in front of our face, letting us know how bad it is, but that they're not going to do anything. I think that's, my question to both of you guys. So maybe I'll go to you first, Harrison. What are your thoughts?
I wouldn't be surprised if there are some prosecutions. Depends. It depends what is found and what is made public. But I would say that the way I see the situation right now is that this is the second American Revolution.
Yeah, I agree.
And that it is akin to the fall of the Soviet Union in the USSR, so in the early 90s.
Yes.
And what you had then was the fall of the Soviet Union was a revolution from above. You had one elite faction that took control of the system and eliminated a whole bunch of existing institutions, retained some, and repurposed it for the Russian Federation. You had a lot of holdover of personnel throughout from the communist era into the new era, but a lot of people went. And like with a lot of the ex-communist regimes, there was kind of, if not an explicit, then an implicit understanding. We're in power now. We won't throw all of you in prison, but just understand, we're in power now. And as long as that happens, then it's kind of like a tacit amnesty. You no longer have a job. You no longer have access to the money you had. You no longer have access to the network that you had. You no longer have access to any of this bureaucracy by which you were able to do what you did for your entire career and longer, the careers that came before you. You no longer have any of that. That's the way it's going to stay. And that seems to be the way a lot of like peaceful regime changes go, peaceful revolutions from above or sometimes below, that there's this transfer. And you either like the people that are no longer in power, it's up to them to realize, okay, I'm no longer in power and I have to be cool with that, because if I'm not, then I face the risk of having the wrath of the entire system that I was a part of coming down on me. So I would guess that there will be some prosecutions, but I wouldn't say that if there aren't, that it's necessarily a bad thing. Because the best thing, like, again, I'm a pragmatist here. The best thing is to get these people out of power. If that means agreeing not to arrest them and that they'll go peacefully, then fine. If you're threatening them, then they're more likely to lash out.
Sure.
That's why in Ponerology, Lobachevsky recommended amnesty, because it's a lot more difficult when you're threatening them. They're going to lash out like a trapped animal, like a cornered animal. But if you open the path and say, go in this direction, and here's the stick that I'm going to use like to beat you with if you don't go in that direction, then fine, just go.
That's actually a great point, because they're psychopaths. So threatening them or putting them over a barrel would only make them be psychopaths, even worse.
It's like, we know who you are, but you're not coming back to work.
Right.
I hope there are going to be some prosecutions, because some examples need to be set. But like Harrison, I don't think it's going to be extensive or as extensive as it could or should be. And probably for the reasons that he gave, that maybe it's not necessary. So, but I just wonder if the liberal left of America would be as willing to submit as the communists of Russia were when the Soviet Union fell. Some of if you see some of the things that they post on X, some of these meltdowns they're having.
Oh, it's insane. Well, so does that actually mean the left? And again, I hate labeling people, but is the left of the last 30 years, the Hunter, what's the guy's name that Saul, what was his name? Saul Alinsky. If that version of the left is done, like literally gone, like will never come back, is it that big of a repudiation?
I hope so. I mean, if you look at the core tenets of like someone like Saul Alinsky that gave form to Obama and all of these
Clinton
social justice warriors, or whatever you want to call them, my opinion, I think those are cancers on the face of humanity. And if you look at like what's happened in Los Angeles, with that being burned with fires, those directed energy weapons, whatever's going on there, in a weird way, again, that's extremely sad. I would never like want anyone to be harmed. But if you kind of look at it to the nature of, like Laura talks about in Earth Changes and the Human Cosmic Connection, of like human behavior having a certain outcome. Like if you beat your shoulder with a stick enough, you're going to get a bruise on your shoulder, and eventually like you're going to get an infection. There's going to be like bad consequences of that. And I kind of think of like those ideologies, because of the nature of what they do to humanity and how their service itself, it kind of ends up in like a way that like creates this negative reaction to the body of humanity. So I would hope so. But I think, like Laura was saying, we have this duality of like service to others and service to self. And there's like expansion and contraction. And that's like the contractile nature of living here. And so like you will probably always have those type of ideologies crop up, but I think at least like there's an expansive awareness aspect to it, to like where people have the ability to kind of understand, to move away from it. I guess if that makes sense.
One last comment I'd like to put in there. One of my friends on Substack, John Carter, just put up a really good article. I can't
just
remember the name
read
of
it.
it.
By the way, you got
yeah.
me into following him. That guy's amazing.
Yeah. And I like the way he put it. I was thinking the same thing, and he just expressed it because he's got a way with words. So he expresses the thoughts that I have, and I don't even have to tell him to do it. And but the way he put it, if you look at the structure that the left or the establishment created, it took them decades to build.
Right.
Decades of all of these little maneuvers and inching here and there and pushing and blah blah blah, and it took all of that effort, literally decades, to establish what they had, and that is gone now. It was gone in a week. You can't just bring it back. That's why he's calling it the second American Revolution. That's why I'm calling it that too.
I agree with that.
I think it literally is that that momentous of an event, is that was destroyed in a week, and it will take decades for it to come back. So that's not saying that nothing bad ever is going to happen. That this is like the golden age, but things are a lot better than they were 2 months ago, and decades of work has just gone down the drain for the people that created all of these institutions of corruption. Like, that is a huge win in my estimation.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. So Laura, to his point there, because it just hit me as he said all that, and I agree. I really do agree with that point, that it really is the second great American Revolution right now. Was this necessary for the shift, the realm border crossing, whatever we want to call the ascensional moment? Did the darkness have to come to light for us as a conscious frequency, or again, the group that makes it to the next level, whatever we call that? Did this have to happen? Was this a necessary actually occurrence?
Yeah, I think so. And the way I've always thought about it is in terms of electricity, contact potential difference.
Mm-hmm.
In order to bring a big inflow of light, there has to be a very deep darkness that can attract it. And I also think about something that the C's said. They talked two things they said. They said that there would be a level playing field at the time of the transition.
Yep.
And they also said something along the lines of, they asked me to remember a prophecy, which was that, things would be really horrible, and then there would be a change, and then things would be good, peace and safety. People are saying, it's peace and safety. And then would come
the crazy. Yeah.
The end of what they said was the end, like the end of the cycle, the transition. So I wonder if this is what we're in right now, is the preparation for that, because they say that, whenever there's like a tsunami, before the tsunami comes in, all the water goes out.
Right.
So, we are not out of the woods yet, I don't think. And we have to stay vigilant, even in the face of people saying peace and safety.
It kind of makes you wonder if Trump and Musk are actually not who we think they are.
I'm inclined to, feel rather fond and favorable towards them at the moment, because they're doing a lot. So I'm not going to complain.
Yeah, it's definitely a lot better. But I mean, it would be the ultimate ruse or the ultimate parlor trick.
Trump is what, 78 years old or something?
Yeah.
And he's really burning up his energy fast. So I don't think he's got an agenda. You can't buy him. He's got plenty of money.
No.
You can't buy Musk. He's got plenty of money. They are, perfect examples of Lobachevsky talking about the scions of evil pathocrats who don't buy into it, and they go against it in the end. So, yeah, I think we've still got interesting time ahead. And I think the last session, the C said things are going to be thrilling, and that was their word, thrilling. So, and it has been thrilling.
Incredible. Yeah.
This point has been thrilling, and I just hope that we get more thrills.
Yeah.
Well, it's
Yeah.
just started.
Yeah, I was gonna say
It
we're
seems
probably
like-
just getting started.
It seems like it has just getting started, but I think too, just to end this show, and again, thanks to everyone who's watched. It's been really amazing. I'm grateful for everybody that's here. And of course, you three amazing people. I think it's kind of like a clearing right now. And if in the power of each of us individually to work on ourselves, like it's giving us more latitude to do that right now, because you can now see for yourself what was quote unquote bad or evil and what wasn't. So as you were saying, Laura, like the truth is coming to light, but it's still up to us each as an individual to accept what truth is. And there is no, as you know, in the new age, the levels of truth. Your truth is not my truth. So I think we're kind of at a place now where people have to either accept truth for what it is. Obviously, truth is only for the most sincere. And if you don't, that's fine. You got more work to do. And if we are getting close to the wave, or the realm border crossing or ascension or whatever it is, then, that's fine. You might have to have another do-over or two. You don't make it.
I don't want to do it.
Yeah, I don't.
Yeah.
I mean, none of us want to do over. I mean, no.
So, yeah, I think that sums it up.
Beautiful. All right. Well, for Jay Campbell, Hunter Williams, Harrison Cooley, and Laura Knight-Jadczyk, we will say goodbye to you guys until we see you guys again. Thank you guys for being out here. Of course, support their work, support their Substack, support Laura's books. Go to the Cassiopaea forum, which I put a link in earlier in the show to it, and sign up and subscribe. It's totally free. And there's a lot of amazing conversations there. So you guys, we appreciate you guys. We'll see you guys again very soon. You guys stay for a second.